Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, here with a couple rock stars in the data world, folks. We're going to talk about a very fun topic, and that is cool jobs in data. And there are lots and lots of cool jobs in data these days. A few years ago, I think it was the New York Times that said data scientist is the sexiest job to have. And these days, there are lots of very cool jobs that you can have. And part of the reason is because a lot of the blocking and tackling of traditional data management is now largely handled for you. Certainly, if it's in the cloud, a lot of that stuff is taken care of for you, but even on prem, a lot of the tools and technologies have taken care of some of the hard stuff, the grittier things that you have typically had to worry about over the years. And so now you can do more of the value added stuff, more of the interesting things, finding patterns in the data, troubleshooting, problem solving, doing the cool stuff that makes you feel good and have fun. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we've got Joe Gasca. He is the CEO of a company called Grax. He's been around the business for a while. And we've got Stephen Manley from a company called Druva. He's the CTO over there. So let's just kind of dive in and introduce ourselves. Joe, I'll throw it over to you first. You've been in the data space for a while now. And of course, Grax is focused heavily on the Salesforce world, but you're all about capturing signal too. So tell me a bit about yourself and Grax and what you guys are working on these days.
Yeah, great, Eric. Thanks a lot. So Grax is a data lifecycle management focused specifically on Salesforce. And like you said, data itself is really starting to become very sexy again, right? When you really think about, the full life cycle of any data, data creates data, right? So when we hyper focused on Salesforce, specifically if it's backup, if it's archive, if it's restore, you think of those tactical obligations that you have with data, right? How do I protect it? How do I recover from it? But also having every version of data has really interesting possibilities when you start looking for signals and variants and trends and anomalies. Not just saying that, hey, did something bad happen? But what are the opportunities and strategic advantages with the data itself and the history? And that's really where we've been hyper focused on. What is your data? What does your data history tell you? And what is the trends of your data itself? And that's really where some very interesting things are happening.
Yeah, and just to get our other guest in the early stages here, I'll throw it over to Stephen Manley from a company called Druva. I've been following those guys for a number of years now, doing some very interesting work as well. Just tell us quickly about yourself and Druva, and you've got a recent announcement you're talking about too. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm CTO here at Driva. Been here for about 5 years or so. Spent most of my life protecting people's data. And Driva, you can think of us as a SaaS company that secures and protects data for our customers. So to Joe's point, they're very Salesforce focused. We're focused on everything. You've got data all over the place, whether it's in Microsoft 365 or your data center, or your endpoints or remote offices. We want to protect and secure it all for you. And in addition to having all those versions and being able to recover and all the fundamentals that Joe talked about, we're also super passionate about the metadata, right? What can I learn by understanding what's happening to your data over time, and what kind of things can we expose to you? And so, like you said, we have a big announcement. We just launched what we call Drew Investigate, which is a Gen AI, sort of, we call it a co-pilot that really helps companies that are worried about, am I under some sort of cyber attack, some sort of ransomware attack, really helping guide them towards understanding, what administrators could have been compromised, what data, what systems could have been compromised, and using that metadata we've got access to again, get them to the right answer faster, because the faster you respond, the faster you recover, the faster you're back up and running and doing cool stuff with your data again.
Yeah, that's interesting. And real quick, talk about the Gen AI side of that. Are you using Gen AI to articulate text that explains what the systems are doing? Is that kind of the use case there?
Yeah, so it's sort of a multi-layered cake of Gen AI. So one of the things that we've found as we've gotten into this Gen AI space is that everybody sort of goes, well, all right, it's a chatbot. And that's the top layer of the cake, right? A natural language interface so you can, again, if you're not an expert in using Druva or Grax or whatever tool you want, it's a natural language interface. So that's the top layer of the cake. But then there's other layers of the cake behind it, because you need something that's going to be able to translate that natural language into, well, what problem are you looking to solve? Are you worried about, sort of administrators that have gone rogue or been compromised? Are you worried about whether your Microsoft 365 environment just suddenly has a bunch of encrypted data. So you need that second layer of Gen AI to really interpret what the customer is asking. And then the third layer of the cake is then connecting to the backend metadata and saying, well, look, we've seen thousands of ransomware events through the years. We can understand from your question and what's happening, this is the area you need to be looking. And so with the Gen AI space, if you've just got that natural language interface, it's good. But if you can actually start to correlate the information with the history, that's when you start to really get some interesting conclusions. And it's not just a search or a natural language interface. It's actually helping you drive your investigation because it's that expert that's sitting on your shoulder saying, this is where you should be looking right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting similarity between what Druva is doing and what Grax is doing, because to your point a moment ago, Joe, I'll throw it back over to you. Grax has been focused on this data lifecycle management, which is very important to understand where we've come from, where we're going. You can't tell where you're going if you don't know where you came from, right? Because it's all part of a trajectory. And you figured out a long time ago that you want to allow your customers to have knobs they can turn about just how granular of data they want to capture, but you want to be able to capture everything. And Salesforce, let's face it, Salesforce is a juggernaut. It's kind of the poster child for software as a service. They've been around forever and a day. Of course, Mark Benioff, very, very smart businessman. They bought Tableau, they bought Slack, they bought all kinds of other things, and now they are a huge center of gravity into themselves. And of course, Salesforce is focused on, wait for it, sales. And no company succeeds without making money somehow. You get investment, but then you have to go buy, get people to buy your technology and your software. So maybe talk, Joe, about the importance of having that history, being able to detect signal over time, and maybe give us some examples of what you're able to do for your clients.
Sure, absolutely. So just like Stephen was saying, but the one key thing, I think that's the commonality between everything, is protecting your history and owning your history as a company is both tactically and strategically important. We all know this. And the one thing I know that Druva and we have been focused on is you have to eliminate the single vendor risk, right? Salesforce, even buying own backup and having your backups being owned by Salesforce, that is single vendor risk. And a lot of companies that are looking out saying, not only do I want to protect, but I need to own my history, either from audit, compliance, and regulatory reasons that you can govern all of that. But the history itself, much like what Stephen was saying, is there's a lot of very interesting things that you can learn from your history, right? Whether it's pattern recognition, whether it's reacting to an event that is causing you adverse event from security, or whether it's reacting to sales more efficiently. The one thing commonality between a lot of our companies that are going out there and really saying and preaching the word, because we understand how valuable history is. And the one thing that we're working hard for is to make sure our customers are protected. Customers are protected for having the optionality in the future of owning your history, making sure that you can make meaningful decisions from your history is critical. So the one thing that we've been hyper-focused on, I know Druva is very, very similar to us, is basically capture history, protect it. If you need it, you have that optionality. And that's the key piece right now, is really thinking ahead as AI and machine learning is evolving. And we know 3, 5, 10 years out from now, the technologies, the leaders, all of the capabilities from Azure, GCP, AWS, they're all going to evolve with new technologies, new capabilities, being locked into a single ecosystem where you can use that history. That really was where the problems come in. And that's one thing that we've been hyper-focused on, is saying, listen, Salesforce has one version of data. As soon as you deploy Grax, we have every single version of data, every single version of metadata, every single version of files, attachments, binary streams, everything, every
Wow.
single piece of data that you possibly need. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I'm sure Stephen is running into this as well, is, okay, now that you have the history, and we are just evolving, much like Druva is, much like everyone saying, wow, Moore's law is driving down the cost of storage. So it's no longer cost prohibitive to store mass amounts of data when petabytes cost, hundreds of dollars. And Salesforce is charging 10,000% more than what basic blob storage costs.
Wow.
Really having that optionality and saying, okay, now that I have my data, and this is where we said really cool jobs come up. we all know that between historical data, as Stephen referred to it, metadata, when a record changes from one value to another, what was the duration? What was the time? What was it before it? All of that metadata about those changes are really what starts to feed power, anomaly detection, signal variance detection. That's really where the very interesting things come. And really, when you're getting it to start, quant-driven decision making, you have to get a lot of patterns and you have to get a lot of history to back test some of these theories, some of these algorithms.
Right, right.
And without the source of truth, without your base raw history, and without protecting that history, you're really locked in and you're really handcuffed to using one AI model. So we focus on Salesforce, and of course, Salesforce, amazing technology, love working with them, great partnerships, and they are going out with a lot of their AI patterns. But we see a lot of companies right now, they don't want to just use one piece of AI technology, they want to use them all. And they want the optionality of doing that. So we're hyper focusing on protecting the data, protect optionality for our customers. We're trying to add value as quickly as we can to that data. And that comes from everything from, as Stephen was alluding to, risk mitigation for if something happens. There's also optionality that we're focusing on is based on pattern recognition for driving revenue or service metrics. Are you at risk for customer attrition? All of that data exists within your history. And that's really where it comes from, cool data jobs. People that have that overlap, that mathematical and analytical mind with understanding data, schema, and history. There's a weird intersection there where people having the quant-driven mindset and understanding data and schema and historical data over time, that's really where you can start getting into how can I build these models. That's when it comes some really cool technology and really start building out. And we're just at the, we think AI and machine learning. This is AI and machine learning is the equivalent of the internet back in the late 90s. We're just at the beginning.
I
Right?
think you're right, and you bring up a really good point. I'll have you comment, and then we'll bring Stephen back in to comment on this. AI loves the gritty, granular details. It doesn't want roll-ups like you would see in a dashboard, for example. It wants that real gritty detail that's trapped in all these various systems. And so by capturing your whole history, Joe, what you're enabling is all sorts of multivariate views of relationships between entities. So it could be uptime versus traffic versus personnel involved in a particular task. It could be any number of things that you don't know about. And what's so cool about these models when you start training them and using them is they pick up stuff that you just were not going to see. I mean, it's like I think I always joke that training a model is like raising a kid. You got to be careful what you expose them to, right? Because they'll just absorb stuff and then it reflects right back at you. And you're like, oh no, I shouldn't have said that in front of my kid. Like if you talk trash about your neighbor, they're like, Daddy says you're a jerk. I'm like, oh no, like there it goes. So you got to be careful about what you go in there. But if it's just transactional data from Salesforce, that's all grist for the mill, right? What do you think, Joe?
So you're 100% right. And I'll tell you kind of an interesting story that when you think about it after the moment, you're going, aha. Like, so if you capture everything from Salesforce, right? System tables, data tables, opportunities, and you said there's indirect correlations between outcomes. That's basically what my mind is going to. And what we're saying is, now think about it. If you have IP logs from where people log in and you can track the effectiveness of your employees with closing deals, you can find an indirect correlation between the effectiveness of your employees closing deals relative to where they're actually logging in from. If I'm going down to the islands and I'm working remotely, but I'm working 4 hours a day and all of a sudden my output dropped, from all of your data, if you really feed them into some of these models, you can find indirect correlations between data that you never assumed. But without it, without your complete history, because this is where it comes in very interesting. People used to pick and choose data. I want to back up this data or this data or this data.
Right.
You're getting part of the story, not all the story.
That's a really good point. I'll ask Stephen to comment on that because you're right. We used to cherry pick what we say because storage was expensive and we didn't want to have all this overhead. Now we realize, especially with machine data, which is very small data, we're not talking about movie files, MPEGs, or anything. You're talking about CSV files, which are very, very light. But to capture all that, you now have a repository of information and relationships that you can leverage in building and leveraging your AI models, right?
Yeah, the interesting thing, and you're 100% right. Having the right amount of data is critical, and I think one of the things you said, Eric, too, is it's got to be good data, right? Because if you train it on garbage in, garbage out, if you train it on poor data, if you train it on bad data, you're not going to be happy with the results you get. Now, one of the things that we found really interesting is, you know, and this is a little, this is where we faced a different challenge than Joe did, right? Because if you look at Joe's customers, yeah, Salesforce is your system of record. There's so much information in Salesforce that if you just unlock it and unleash it, even within one company, you can find amazing things. What we found is because we started, looking very much at sort of cyber attacks and how to respond to cyber attacks and using Gen AI there. Well, any given company, fingers crossed, isn't getting hit 12 times a year with a cyber attack, right? If it is, we really need to have a different kind of discussion. And
Right.
so what we realized was, but because we happen to be a SaaS offering, I've got 6,000 plus customers, and so I can learn across them of what happens in a cyber attack, so that you can start to build a model that is generic across those customers,
Mm.
where and it's not that you're training it on each of these customers' data, because that's a no-no, right? You've every customer's data has to be unique, privately held, privacy maintained. But those trends you see of these are the things that happen in a cyber attack, if you can train a model on that, now I don't need as much data on any individual customer, because I've got that intelligence from a much broader set. And so this is the race we're all on, is can we get enough good data to be able to get good results? And so this is why I think Joe's so keen on, you need that history, because that pumps it full of data of what you've been doing in your organization. It's the
Right.
same reason for us why being SaaS is so important. Having that breadth of a view gives you so much more insight into what's going on, because in the end,
That's
the model will only be as good as what you put into it.
Yeah, that's very interesting stuff too, and we'll talk about this in the next segment because you come up with these models and then you can hydrate it and test it against all the data because you've captured that over time. You got to be able to test these things and understand, okay, how's it going to react here, there, et cetera, before you push it to production. But this is all very interesting, and I want to talk about what you may be describing here, which I think is called structured causal models. But we'll talk about that in the next segment, folks. Stand by. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all about cool jobs in data, and we've got uh, Joe Gasca from Grax and Stephen Manley from Druva on the show today, and we were just talking about AI models. Very, very interesting stuff. As Joe had mentioned, we're very early days in this right now. This is definitely a new wave of innovation that we're seeing, and there's a lot of R&D that's gone into this. There's a lot of time that has to be spent in understanding what these things do. I mean, one of my good buddies in the industry, Dr. Usama Fayyad, he heads up what is it, the Institute for Experiential AI out of Northeastern University, I think, in Massachusetts. And he joked to me at the beginning of the year, he said, these models, they're too big. They're not supposed to work. We don't know why they're working. And this guy is an AI expert, okay? He was the first chief data officer from Yahoo. And he's saying, yeah, it's not supposed to work. Like he's sort of half joking, but his point is that they are very, very complex and they can actually learn things, right? So the aha moment for me with the Gen AI stuff was realizing that when you train a model on a big corpus of text, it's not actually persisting that text the way you think in the old database world where it's strings of text persisted exactly as they were delivered. No, what you're doing is adjusting the weights and balances and the parameters of the model, which then can absorb things and learn and do interesting stuff. So there's all this research being done. I'll throw it over to Stephen maybe to talk about this because you've got this new AI investigator thing, which
Yep.
sounds like it fits into this world. But the point is, if you get the right model, you can slap it on top of a big, large data set and get answers very, very quickly in a much different dynamic than we're accustomed to doing. So there is a mindset change that has to happen here as people explore, but they are probabilistic. So you always have to keep that in mind. These new Gen AI models are probabilistic. They are not deterministic. So there's always going to be a little bit of a gray area you have to watch out for. But Stephen, maybe just comment on that and talk about how your new AI investigator is fitting into this new interesting category.
Yeah, and just to sort of geek out at a low level just for a minute or two. Yeah, everybody out there has probably played with some sort of Gen AI tool just from a consumer perspective, and they're great. And they're especially great because it's been trained on such a huge corpus of data. And to your point, we don't expect it to be 100% accurate. Now, as you shift into more of a corporate business setting, the thing you notice is first off, there are fewer and fewer sort of base models, base LLMs than there used to be because it's getting so expensive to train an LLM.
Right.
And so our viewpoint on this is, the world's going to end up with 3 to 5 LLMs really, and then probably some custom niche ones, but there'll be an anchor of sort of 3 to 5 with different features and functions. And so that's going to be relatively constant. So then the interesting questions start to raise, on all right, how do you train using that model so that you can solve your business problem? And then how do you augment, whether it's through RAGs or through other sorts of technologies to make sure that you're going to get those accurate answers, you're going to eliminate the hallucinations, and you're going to get the performance your customers expect. And so this is why, certainly when we built Investigate, we used RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, to help it better understand what happens in a cyber attack, right?
Mm,
Because when a customer's coming to Drew Investigate, they're not coming to do their homework, right? This
right.
isn't to find out who won the World Series 7 years ago. They're trying to figure out, am I under attack? What are my next steps? And so
Wow.
the RAG really helps keep it focused. Now, the second thing that we see happening is as the amount of data you feed in gets bigger, because this is where Joe was going, the more data, the more good data, the better off you are, the more you want to be able to express those relationships. How does it relate? Because your database analogy is apt. It's not like this is all predefined. We
Right.
want to find these relationships. And so we view, sort of having a graph infrastructure underneath that allows you to dynamically assess what the relationships between the data are really helps you when you're looking for, in our case especially, anomalous behavior.
Hmm.
Joe over here is suddenly doing adjusting backup policies from Costa Rica, which is interesting because Joe's never been to Costa Rica and Joe's never adjusted a backup policy in his life. The fact that he's doing both at the same time is really weird. There's a good chance that Joe's account has been compromised. So these sorts of things happen when you start to be able to build out those full relationships. And so the baseline is great. And there's going to be those 3 to 5 models that just keep getting enhanced. But the value is going to be what you build on top of it, because that's where the real magic is going to happen in the next 3 years.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think RAG is going to be a part of our future. I don't think it's ever going to go away, and I think, frankly, that many software vendors are going to need to figure out where they fit in this new RAG architecture, because I view it as being as significant a transformation as we saw with Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes comes along, Docker first, of course, containerization, Kubernetes kind of rode as like piggybacked on top of that and has now taken over. I mean, Kubernetes arguably won that whole game. And it was a massive transformation. You had to refactor your deck to work, to your stack to work in this new containerized world. And I think similar thing is happening here with this Gen AI stuff, and people are going to have to refactor their and refocus their attention on how are we going to fit in this new world and what is our value add going to be. And Joe, I'll throw it over to you from Grax. I remember you talking about how you folks made good decisions a number of years ago, and that's starting to really pay off. And one of those decisions that really caught my attention was Parquet, that you
Mhm.
glommed on to Parquet as a file format because you're like, you know what, this is going to be big in the future because it's custom designed to facilitate analytics. And now you see that everywhere. See everyone jumping on the Parquet bandwagon. Guess what? It's a de facto standard now. And because you placed that bet, you positioned yourselves very well. Maybe just kind of comment on all that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, I mean, it's basically large data structures, and what's the highest concentration for analytics or data tools for consumption purposes, right? So our data lake itself, when we output it for consumption, we optimized it to optimize the optionality of end consumer of that Parquet data. Our data structure itself is basically a huge graph database and how they interrelationships, but we output it in Parquet for easy and quick consumption for optionality in the future. Right? A lot of things that everyone's talking about today and really thinking about when we think about LLMs, we think about graph and graph theory, right? A lot of these have been around since the 1950s, right? Shortest path algorithms from what's his name, Dijkstra, right, in the 50s, but it wasn't possibility for until compute kind of caught up to where it is. So a lot of these patterns and a lot of these algorithms have existed for a long time, and a lot of theories that you could put them through and say, large volume compute, GPUs, storage cost is down, storage transmission is down. These capabilities have always existed. So, but if you think about now, because of the economies of scale, and because we can now put this in place where it actually makes sense and put these out there, right? It starts to become incredibly interesting with what problems you can attack. Because we used to think before Google, right? Google, you could go in, ask a question, get an answer for the web. Right now, we're starting to see LLM come in and say, okay, we're going to ask questions and get the data. Right? There's evolutions that are happening now at scale, because now instead of having this massive cluster that Google could put up, we could actually now put in the compute to actually get down there. So the Parquet piece that we really hyper focused on in the bets, there's a few key bets that we made beliefs that were different. We believed in bring your own cloud, customers should always own. Our distribution methodology was almost like a distributed compute mechanism. So we have a massive distributed compute cluster that is actually distributed across everybody's cloud. They can have singular models that actually get distributed to the clouds and processed there. But the Parquet piece is 100% correct. We bet on Parquet just because when we start thinking about optionality and protecting your history and reusability for your customers, we have to make sure we protect what's best for the customers. And that is, okay, you have your history, you have the optionality to reuse your history. You're not locked into one singular ecosystem, whether it's Tableau, QuickSight, Power BI, or Snowflake or any of the tools. All of our customers have all the tools.
Yeah, right.
And it's tough to say who's going to win. Like I said, the birth of the beginning of kind of AI and machine learning really at scale is beginning. The theory has always been here, but the beginning of the journey, when you said the first Ethernet was what? Was it the late 70s? Birth of the internet, kind of the mid 90s, right around there. All of that's because Moore's law and getting cheaper and actually going up. When you really start thinking about this, it's really exciting for me. I'm a data nerd at heart. I love this stuff. The more data, the more possibilities. As compute gets cheaper, we throw more at it, more models, but we're just learning from it. It's great. I love this stuff.
Right. No, this is good stuff. And, I'll throw it over to Stephen to comment on. We talked about the history and the optionality. One of the key components of building a model and understanding data is knowing the timestamps. What window of activity do I want to monitor to understand something? Is it a second? Is it a minute? Is it an hour? Is it a day? It depends on the use case. But when you're engaged in a stochastic process of trying to understand something and discover, which is a lot of what is done in the Druva world, right? You're investigating, you're looking for answers, just being showered with data points from every different direction, and you never know where that covariance is going to come from. That's why you want the optionality to be able to test this theory and that theory and do so quickly and then prove it out, right? So that's why it's so important to have this history, to have this richness, and have the capacity to choose your markers and how you cordon off the data to analyze it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of people have heard this stat, but it remains true. The average dwell time at this point for a cyber attack is about 6 months.
That's
So
crazy.
if you're looking just back 2 weeks, I mean, you'll find stuff in the last 2 weeks. That's when usually when it's gone really bad. But in terms of if you really want to sort of diagnose when things started going wrong, when attacks started moving laterally, you're going to want a longer history of data than most security teams keep. And that's because it's expensive for them to keep. Like Joe said, the markup on that storage, you look at how expensive it can be to store those logs. Well, in a lot of these tools, it's incredibly expensive. And so this is one of the things that as Druva, we look and we say, if there's one thing we're really good at effectively and inexpensively storing a lot of data for you And then when you need to get at it, we're really good at bringing it back and feeding it into whatever tool, whatever infrastructure you want to use, so you have it when you need it. And
Yeah.
I think, to me, that's probably the biggest thing, because I think one of the interesting things that I talk about with customers a lot is, we have that same sort of Google search to sort of, we call it ChatGPT sort of analogy. And one of the things I remind them is that while Google was always wildly successful from a consumer, sort of broad internet perspective, organizations, we all continue to struggle with sort of search inside of the enterprise,
Yes.
because again, the challenge you've got is there's not enough data, there's not enough to be able to really train it up the way Google was able to train across the massive corpus of the internet. And that same thing is going to be true as you try to do analytics or use a generative AI inside of your organization. If you're trying to do it in a complete silo and do it all on your own, it's going to be hard. And so you need to sort of attach yourself to, again, a larger collective, a broader perspective, because these things work better when you're at scale. And so
Yeah.
this is what we always try to remind people is, the more you can be part of a bigger picture, the more you've got bringing in, the better the results you're going to be able to get.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's especially interesting when you're talking about machine to machine communication, and that's largely what you're focused on in the security world, right? I mean, there are all sorts of ways you can do these things. I mean, they're just all, I mean, there are like hundreds, probably thousands of technologies in the security space. And it's because security is everywhere, security is everything. And the more interaction you have with machines talking to machines, it gets more and more complex, it gets deeper. That's why you need these traces and these logs and metrics and all these things that you have to sort of galvanize in order to get that clear view of what's happening. That's why all that stuff is important. But I'll tell you something I want to pick up in the next segment here, and I'll just kind of throw out some theories to get your brains simmering a little bit before we go to the next break. Is I'm fascinated by what these Gen AI technologies are going to be able to do, especially with these similarity searches on a corpus of enterprise data. So when you decide to go ahead and load your log files into a vector database that's part of your RAG model, for example, you're loading all this history, you're training the model, you're creating what someone calls anchors of truth, right? That's what your embeddings are. They're moorings designed to keep this Gen AI engine really focused and trained on your data, on your problems, on your situations. I think we're going to have some very interesting times with these LLMs fused to operational systems, and just sit there and ask it all kind of questions and get all kind of interesting answers back. Now, again, it's not all going to be right, but if you ask someone in your business, hey, what's XYZ? They're not always going to be right. So we don't have to hit this 100% marker that people think we need, this true deterministic worldview. I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of learning about how these systems interact and what the clever, efficient ways will be to troubleshoot and problem solve and prevent and future proof some of these systems. I think it's going to be really interesting, and that's going to be a very, very cool job in data. But folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, having a fun, deep, exploratory session here with Joe Gasca of Grax and Stephen Manley from Druva. And Joe, the topic today is cool jobs in data, and I think one of the coolest jobs in data is going to be people who get access and usage rights for these technologies to play around with Gen AI engines and your own RAG model to examine your business. And you can play a huge part in this, it seems to me, Grax, because you have all this history and this optionality to facilitate either fine tuning a model or helping with your RAG architecture and getting those really cool embeddings to enable someone to just discover and just look around and learn things. A lot of times businesses are very reactionary because things are happening fast and you just got to stay on top of your game. But if you have the time and effort to dedicate staff to really exploring your data, exploring your history, I think that's going to be about the coolest job there is. But what do you think about that, Joe?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the really interesting things that we try to really hyper focus on is, if you start at the end and work backwards, right? And you start saying, listen, much like what Steve was saying, is if it's predicting risk exposure, or minimizing your surface area of exposure for what is out there, and working backwards in understanding what the signals are and being able to back test models to predict that.
Right. Right.
What's really interesting to me is how quick, if you have history and enough technology know-how, how quick you can run theories and tests and validations. Once you have these theories working backwards, saying, I wonder if this signal plus this signal or this event or this possible pieces, let me go and run a back test and let me change it and see if I can increase the probability of success of predicting the outcome. Now, the biggest thing that we all know, data doesn't necessarily just smack you in the face and tell you anything. Doesn't just say, here, there it is, there's a magic piece.
Right.
You have to know what you're working towards, right? Starting at kind of the goal or objective. If it is it, hey, I want to reduce customer churn. Do I want to increase customer revenue? Do I want to reduce risk exposure? And then the data folks, this is really where it becomes interesting. This is where it almost becomes, it used to be sexy before. People would be, start with a blank canvas, paint a painting, you're a painter. But you have to realize when the technologists now are starting with a blank canvas and starting with a theory, you're painting a painting with that data and trying to understand, what does the story tell you? And how do I put it together to do the prediction? That really now is becoming both art and science to accomplish. Because you have to take really the analytical approach of saying, this is my final outcome. Then you have to back test theories and have creativity to understand cause and correlation.
Right.
And then you have to come across the chasm to say, how do I get there? That's a very creative experience from the people that are engineers. When you start with nothing and you finally create something, you feel very satisfied. It's the same thing with the data folks. You're starting with a theory now where you're saying, okay, how can I prove that my theory of these signals can predict this outcome, and then working through it. That there is one of the most, for me, one of the sexiest jobs. If you're not worried about plumbing and you're starting to really understand, especially if you can blend math and data skills together.
Yeah.
Right. That's really where it comes, because a lot of the really awful stuff that you want to do in technology is integration. When you're just really doing the plumbing and you're saying, I want to fix this bug to suck this data over here. The cool problems are, now that I have the data, what's the data or the data of the data telling me, and how can I use that to actually impact or influence the business? That right there is the sexy jobs, I think, in data for me. And there's so many things that people have magically called it, like data scientist, right? Data analyst, right? There's so many names that the evolution that has come through. But believe it or not, the small talent window of people that can really take the outcome and basically take the raw material, which is the paint, and paint the painting, which is basically, that's the creativity that it takes. And it really does take the right mind to be able to think, how do I connect the raw material coming in to the outcome goal there? What's the gap between it? And that's going to take, obviously, knowledge of math, basic statistical variance, weighted models and graphs, there's lots of different pieces. Of course, you can run it through standard technology out there, but there still is gaps in creativity no matter what. People might think AI is going to eat the world, but it's not, because you still need that creativity of how to apply that to really get to your outcome.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. And I think it does favor the polymath, right? It does favor someone who, to your point, is the artist and the scientist, because it's both. Science is very cold and calculating. Art is very warm and enriching and different and strange. And to be able to fuse those things together is very, very compelling. And Stephen, I'll throw it back over to you. Certainly in your world, you want your teams and your clients to be able to test theories very quickly. Is this going to work? Is that going to work? Be able to regression test, basically analyze, okay, if I tried this, what would that have looked like? All those sorts of things, those are learning experiences. And even if you're wrong 9 times, if you're right the 10th time, that's the time that you saved your bacon of your organization, right?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, to sort of echo on what Joe was building on too. When we first started, building Drew, right? And Drew investigates the second, sort of aspect of Drew. The first was Drew Assist, which was really to help customers troubleshoot any sort of issues they had in the system, like, my backups are failing because my network is down, guiding them towards how to handle that. When we first started, we were a bit naive, right? Like most people, we said, "Oh, we'll just throw whatever questions we want at the AI interface, and it'll give us answers." And that is technically true. It did give us answers. They were often not the right answers,
Right.
but they were answers. And so what we found is, to Joe's point on the art and the science, we had to get a lot smarter and a lot more focused on how do you guide Drew to make sure it's giving the customers the right answer. And
Hmm.
so, like we talked about earlier, things like a RAG to make sure that it is being trained on the appropriate data, being able to stack multiple models, because certain LLMs are better at parts of responding to a question, other LLMs are better at doing correlation on the back end, and so we said it's not just one model, these are stacked. In terms of performance, being able to get different tiers of models, because you might, some problems are easier to answer than others, and so it'll go faster and you can do it more inexpensively. And so I think when we got into this market, like I said, we were naive. We thought, oh, there's almost like Joe said, there's data there, we'll throw it into an LLM and answers will magically come out. What we found after a year of painstaking work is there's a lot of work and there's a lot of art and there's a lot of science to be able to release something that can actually give customers the right answer so that they can ask their questions and be comfortable and confident in the response they get. Now,
Hmm.
the other thing, and maybe, I don't know if this is on the radar screen, but the other thing we see coming up all the time now is, and now that you're doing it, I needed a little bit more transparency on how you got to that answer.
Right.
And
Show your
uh,
work.
exactly, right?
Right.
So I need reproducibility, ethical AI. And so this is a lot of the focus for us now is, like every customer, can you prove to me that my data is not getting mingled with anyone else's, that my requests and queries aren't getting mingled with anyone else's? Can you show me every step you took along the way so that I can be confident? What data drove this decision? And then, of course, can you be confident that your model is not biased in any way so that this is an ethical AI? And so I think this is where we're going to go next is step one, can you get the right answers? But step two, can you prove it? Because I love that the answer's right, but I need to be, trust but verify.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen this evolve fairly quickly. I mean, that's one of the things that has really kind of blown my mind. I had Bob Muglia on this show about a year ago, I want to say, and he, of course, was the first CEO of Snowflake. He's a pretty
Yep.
well known, pretty accomplished guy in the industry. And he was joking. He was saying, I had a number of complaints about these models 2 months ago, and they've already been fixed. So it's like, and I think you're going to really continue to see a layering of functionality that you'll be able to purchase
Yep.
or implement yourself around the RAG models, for example, around data quality checks, hybrid search, basically. So your whole structured deterministic world isn't going to go away. It is going to be leveraged by these large language models or small language models, and you're always going to want to show your work. And so like Click Answers, we did a show with them a few weeks ago. They not only will give you the answer, they'll show you where they got the answer. So you get a drop down menu that says, we got this from page 2, we got that from page 7, we got this from page 13, and here's how we put it together. That builds confidence, it builds trust, it fosters good feelings from the business people using it, and that is
Yep.
the direction. I think you're exactly right. You want to trust but verify. Yes, I'm glad you got the right answer this time. How did you get it? Show your work just like your math teacher told you. But folks, podcast bonus segment is coming up next. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, time for the podcast bonus segment with Joe Gasca from Grax, that's Grax, and Stephen Manley from Druva, Drew, as we call it these days, Drew Assist, and then Drew Investigate. And Joe, you made a really good point in the break there. We were just chatting about how the future of backup is really on fire right now because so many companies using AI are going to have to, especially in regulated industries like healthcare and financial services, store their models and store the data that the models were trained on just in case they get sued somewhere down the line. That's a boon for future business in your space. Maybe just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, as we know, as AI is increasing so fast that government agencies have not even kept up with regulatory and governance of kind of the AI and the technologies. As we get in more AI technologies that is getting into regulated industries, you really have to think these regulated industries are under scrutiny for a certain duration of time, whether it's healthcare, 7 years, whether it's finance, worm compliance, HIPAA, all these different pieces. If you start getting into the basic premise of if an AI assistant is giving advice to someone, an individual, which causes an adverse or negative event. For example, if you're a diabetes company and you use an AI person to give advice with when to give insulin and something bad happens, you have to prove to the regulatory governance of what the model was and what data you back tested it with. So
Right.
not only do you have to protect your data, but you now have to protect your models and the data that you trained your models with, so you can prove to the government agencies that you actually back tested this with the right amount of data that meets your governance. So all of this is just catching up, and I've been talking to a lot of government agencies that they're starting to really talk about this. This is a big thing when you start talking about data backup, preservation, proof, because you have to start talking about, did I store the data in immutable storage? Did anybody modify that? You can prove
Mm.
it. Like there's a lot more governance to backup right now that just basically exploded as soon as AI came on the board right now, saying, oh, now you have to store all of this. And
Mm.
that's your responsibility as a company.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean the stakes are high. I'll throw it over to Steven to comment on. The stakes are very high because especially if you're regulated, you have to retain all of this stuff, and you have to, it's interesting. I remember hearing this in the data science world like 2 or 3 years ago. Folks were talking about the repeatability problem in data science and the fact that they couldn't repeat the results. And I thought to myself, then you're not doing science because repeatability is clearly a foundational component of science. Like you want to document everything you've done such that if you do it again, you get the same answer. And it's interesting with these new Gen AI models, they are a bit unwieldy. If you give it the same prompt one day to the next, you're going to get a different answer because the world has changed and the models, slightly alter or whatever. So it is just odd that we have this curious challenge now of repeatability because that's not really science, right? What do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because all the customers we meet when they start thinking about what level of protection do I need on my Gen AI environment, and it's exactly where we were talking. They're less worried about backup. They're less worried about, well, I might need to restore it because there's an outage or someone makes a mistake. It's the GRC problem, right? It is the compliance, the governance and compliance that they are very worried about. And when you have that conversation, like you said, you start to realize all the pieces that go into it. Just throwing some out. You've got your training data. You've got the environment that you ran your training in. There's your inference environment and the models and the weights and your RAG and your vector database and a graph database and the results that were output. And there are all these pieces. And so when a customer looks at this, they say, what do I do here? Right. And in some ways, it's very similar to if we're going to pivot all the way back to where Joe was when they first started asking, how do I back up Salesforce? How do I back up Microsoft 365? All of this data is interrelated. I can't just treat it as a bunch of bits. There's a
Right.
relationship here. And so
Interesting.
this is that conversation we're having with them right now around, all right, what are the pieces you need in advance of the regulation that we all know is coming? How do you protect this environment in such a way that you can get that reproducibility, that transparency you're going to need without, of course, breaking the bank because you can't pay infinite amount of dollars to get your compliance. And so this is going to be a really hot topic for the next, I think, 3 to 5 years because it is not an easy and obvious problem to solve. But it's one that you need somebody, you need to be thinking ahead to solve.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I'll just kind of go back to the closing comment here about deterministic versus non-deterministic, right? Versus stochastic or probabilistic is really the term here. And someone was telling me if you read the disclaimer on ChatGPT, it'll say, do not use this in any healthcare use case scenario. Do not use this and like all these things, kind of like the Q-tips box says, do not put a Q-tip in your ear. It's like, well, isn't that the whole reason I bought this thing?
Yeah.
So there are these legal complications. And you're right. I mean, this is going to be a whole new space. The GRC people, the consultants are loving it. They're like, "Woo, we get to come in and bill a whole bunch of time to, just tell you various things." But I guess I'll give like 60 seconds of final comments from each of you. Joe, go ahead. Final comments.
I mean, if anything, people should know now that history is critically important for your business in the future, right? It's not, as both Steve and I have said, it's not just a tactical obligation and think about is if something bad happens, let me quickly recover from it. History is the source of truth when you're looking both now, right now, and in the future, being able to back test theories and algorithms and AI. So the biggest thing I think we all have in common in the kind of backup world per se is take ownership of your data, protect it, put it under your governance and control. When you're using these SaaS products, whether it be, Microsoft 365, whether it be Salesforce, the fact is you need to take ownership to mitigate risk and also have the optionality in the future. So that's the
Yeah.
biggest thing I can just say to people. And the data folks out there, it's just getting better, right? It's just getting better and better.
Yeah. And final thoughts from you, Stephen. Cool jobs in the future, data, having fun with data, right?
Absolutely. So I think speaking to the people who are in this emerging market of data security, the reality is everybody's data, no matter you're the smallest company, the biggest company in the world, you're a target. And it's a hard problem to solve because you've got so much data in so many places and the attacks are evolving so quickly. Don't go it alone, right? So Gen AI is going to be a vital technology to help you do a better job of diagnosing, responding to, recovering from these attacks. But Gen AI itself is evolving quickly and is difficult. And so the advice I give everybody is, look, there's an army of people coming at you. You want an army of people on your side. So find
Wow.
vendors that you can trust because you're not going to be able to win this battle alone. Who can you trust? Partner up
That's
with them.
that's great advice. Who can you trust? Good stuff. Well, folks, send me an email if you want to be on the show. Info@dmradio.biz. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to DM Radio.